Greg, fantastic to do another episode. How are you doing today?
Good, thanks, Sean. Yeah, post Christmas is well and truly over now, so down to the brass tacks of another easy year. 2026 is definitely already starting off in a bit of a whirlwind.
Yeah, and a whirlwind is probably a great way to describe it because I don't know about you, but certainly the phone has been white hot. Lots of stuff to get into, Trump and Venezuela, Trump and Greenland, Trump and Ukraine. But there does seem to be a slightly bigger picture emerging here, which I think we can get into because I do think 2026, I had started out with higher hopes that Russia was grinding to a bit of a halt in Ukraine. But actually, fundamentally, I think the world has changed. So let's get into, first of all, into Nicolas Maduro, president in Venezuela. Suddenly, President Trump decides to go in there and capture him and his wife. There's lots of questions about whether that was legal. How would we feel if somebody came in and grabbed Sakir Starmer and his wife? Don't answer that. But actually, also when you look at the complexity of the operation, because what appears to be a really simple operation, go in, grab a president, fly away again, over 150 aircraft. What did you make of that operation?
Yeah, well, I mean, let's unpick that. So, I mean, first of all, probably the most telegraphed operation in history, although maybe there are more to come. So there's that, and obviously they were building up, preparing. I mean, you could smell it coming, couldn't you? So let's talk about a little bit about that in a minute. I mean, as for regime change, I mean, I'm not sure the regime has changed. It's just the deputies taken over. But I saw that Donald Trump declared himself as the standing Venezuelan president today on Truth Social. So he's clearly decided who's the boss, and it all appears to be about oil, as of course we all suspected. And I guess Maduro wasn't ready to do a deal. So yeah, an interesting way of doing it, using your military. But what we saw was, let's be honest, a classic US military operation using every tool in the box in a very classic middle of the night, write down all the defensive aids, sneak in, sneak out, like Osama bin Laden on steroids, if you like.
Yeah, one struck me about the actual military operation. First of all, we understand there were over 150 aircraft involved. So you think at face value, helicopter using special forces, Delta Force, go in there, pluck him, go out again. Where the hell do you need 150? But of course, inevitably, as you say, the S-300s, the Venezuelans had some Russian air defense systems, which they needed to roll those back. There's all sorts of B-1s and F-22s, just in case, because Maduro, once again, he had some, what's it, Su-30s and some F-16s, didn't he?
Yeah.
But actually, if you look at the numbers, I think it was about 24 of each. They reckon that only three F-16s are actually airworthy because they've never been invested in. But do you take any risks along the way? But despite all of that, Trump blew it off, and you sort of go. People were generally saying, "Oh, America is the main air power. How on earth would Venezuela stand a chance?" But the critical vulnerability was if any one of those helicopters, packed full of special forces, had been shot down. Bill Clinton, 1992, Black Hawk Down. That changed a superpower having a go at a raid like this into an ocean-going disaster. And there were video images, weren't there, of the helicopters, the Chinooks flying
Yeah.
around. So if you and I can see them, certainly a SA-24 handheld former Soviet thing can take them down. Huge risks involved in that sort of operation.
Yeah, that was not a risk-free operation, even if it was with overwhelming effect. I mean, you only have to be lucky once, right? And the fact that this was so telegraphed, you'd have expected Venezuela to have been as well prepared as possible. I mean, there's all sorts of rumors about whether Russia had flown in kit and advisors and goodness knows what. We've got Cubans involved. I mean, it does bring me back to the American definition of the OODA loop, which I think we all know and love. But the American definition, of course, is observe, overreact, destroy, apologize. So they're always going to go in heavy-handed. They're never going to come out of an operation wondering if they could have done more. So I think the 120 aircraft, 150, whatever the number was, with pretty much every platform and every capability known to man, was deliberately designed to totally overwhelm and be on standby should anything from Venezuela pop up and stick its head above the parapet. My understanding is Maduro was holed up in a house that they'd had a mock-up of. I mean, lesson learned: if you're a despot, don't hide in one place and sit there for weeks on end. The US are pretty good at sorting that sort of problem out. So I guess America took a calculation that this was doable and that they would be in and out without too much trouble, and as it has turned out. So as coups go, it's pretty bloodless. I mean, obviously, I think there were something like 70 odd casualties on the Venezuelan/Cuban side and 7 injuries, I understand, with the US. I think some helicopters came under fire and were hit. But yeah, it's, well, you could argue it's passed off relatively painless, but Trump now owns Venezuela, it would appear, and it would appear that some of the American oil companies don't want any of the action because of the state of the oil infrastructure.
Well, can we just unpick that a bit? Because you and I have been involved in a number of military operations over the years, and I'm talking about generally. Generally speaking, the military do a good job. They do what they're asked to do. They put their lives on the line, and incredibly scary, incredibly courageous, but they generally deliver success. But military is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. So the end, as you described it, seems to be regime change. In other words, America will pluck out Maduro, and the whole of Venezuela will go, thank you, peace and democracy reigns. And yet, there's huge an ecosystem there of drug money, of corruption, of oil sales and stuff like that. Just because you take off President Maduro, does that really mean that that whole ecosystem that relies on him and the infrastructure, they're motivated by the status quo? Is that really going to change the way Venezuela is run?
Well, I think that is the $64 million question. There's another question for me, which I think is even more serious: is Trump? Oh, Trump is clearly approaching this very differently to previous American presidents. Iraq and Afghanistan, years and years of trying to change regimes from within, in placing your own people, removing entire sort of infrastructures and hierarchies. He's clearly wants to do this quick. That's his style: get in, do the deal, get out, and no casualties, and then declare victory overnight. Is he learning that this is how it works for America? So he's done it in Venezuela. He sort of did it in Iran with the 10-day war. Does he now think he can do this in Iran again with a regime change, as opposed to taking out nuclear bunkers? And I think if I was in the American military right now, I'd be having a devil of a job trying to convince some of the political decision makers as to what is a sensible course of action, because he has been lucky a couple of times, or you could argue they've overwhelmed through sheer might. My concern is are they learning the wrong lessons, that you can actually win these things and solve them overnight? Because as we know, that's rarely the case. Libya is another example.
Yeah, no, I get it, but you and I have also had a perpetual discussion about with our army colleagues that air power does this stuff, and they say, yeah, but it doesn't hold ground. And just because you do an incredibly complicated air operation, and ostensibly Trump is probably right to declare a fantastic success, that there was huge threat, go in, go out, a few bullet holes on airfield, on aircraft, and a few people injured, but ultimately a great success. But military success, but unless you put people on the ground, unless you actually turn the dial, most of my understanding, most of the political opposition have been either locked away or do not live in the country anymore. The oil, I understand American companies were in Venezuela for many years and then left because of the oil infrastructure was brought back. And I do think if you look at this idealistically, Venezuela sits on more oil than even Saudi Arabia. It should be a fabulously wealthy country. I did a bit of work in Saudi Arabia some time ago, and the maths was explained to me that Saudi Arabia gets paid $1 billion a day for doing nothing, allowing people to take their oil out. What a great basics of our economy. So Venezuela should be in a similar situation. We have in our country, we've got nothing like that. So we have to generate wealth by industry and the like. And so I just don't see how overnight this is going to change. And as you say, the oil companies in America have said it's going to be 60 billion. I've heard some numbers to investment. It's going to be 10 years to get the oil industry turned around. We've had our fingers burnt in the past. Unless you do put boots in the ground and take over, is that really what America wants to do? It just doesn't feel it's been thought through.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we underestimate Trump at our peril, but he is clearly taking a very different tack here. I think you're right. I think that the infrastructure there is poor, so it's going to require an awful lot of investment. The oil in Venezuela is particularly dirty oil, so it does require more effort to refine it. So there's no simple answers or overnight fixes here. I think this issue of boots on the ground, and Trump clearly thinks that a few well placed CIA agents and some harsh tweets or Truth Social posts are enough to keep Venezuela in its place. And you could argue that with overwhelming military effect parked just over the horizon, he can pretty much tell them what he wants them to do. And it might not be perfect, but it'll be good enough. And so, yeah, he is changing the rules of the game to a large extent. And he's done it in Iran that first time and declared success. He's now done it in Venezuela. Goodness knows where he might want to take it next. Talk about that in a minute, probably. But yeah, it's another way of doing things that doesn't embroil America in long-winded and high casualty operations. And this is Trump the businessman, not Trump the military strategist or long-term
But
campaigner.
does it trample international law?
Oh, well, there's a question. I mean, I was fascinated to see that Trump's put this guy up for trial in New York in a court that Trump himself decried as illegitimate and rubbish. So yeah, there's some amusement there. They're trying this guy as a narco criminal that they just pulled off the street. When actually he was the president of a country. Now, I'm not going to support Maduro and his ilk. And there's clearly a lot of talk about how legitimate his position as president was, but it does rewrite the rule book to a degree. But it's not the first time we've done regime change. Let's all not kid ourselves. Whether it be Afghanistan or Iraq or Libya, that's exactly what we did, and we did it as NATO or we did it as coalitions. So we can't all sit here being too righteous. But this
Hasn't
is
worked very
pretty
well, though,
unique.
has it? Hasn't worked very well so far.
No, well, no, and I think that's why he's tried a different way of doing it. He didn't want to get embroiled in doing this the long-winded way. And Trump's sitting there gloating, looking at everyone saying, well, you guys took years and end up coming out with your tail between your legs. I've done it overnight.
So so there's a pattern building here, though, isn't there? And I think that's why this is interesting. So let's extend that pattern to Greenland. So Trump, having just walked into a sovereign nation, deposed the president, then in the next breath is saying, I need Greenland, and doesn't write off using military force to take it. It is part of the Kingdom of Denmark that is a fellow NATO member. And all of a sudden, everybody's looking at each other going, well, this is completely mad. But going, yeah, but he went into Venezuela. What what is he capable of, and what are the implications of that? So I just find it fascinating because Greenland's never really been an area we've talked much about. I mean, it's a vast wasteland. It's a massive island. It's the biggest island in the world. I think it's 9 times the size of the United Kingdom, so it's huge. But why does he want it? And what is this threat all about? And do we take him seriously?
I mean, he'll use any argument that he thinks will stick. I mean, I laugh. Someone said the other day, isn't it awful that NATO is going to collapse all because of the Mercator projection? Because it's actually not as big as he thinks it is. Because if he was to look at it on a globe as opposed to on a stretched out map, it wouldn't be quite as big as he thinks. He also said he doesn't want to be neighboring Russia. Well, he might want to go over to Alaska one day, which he did do with Putin, of course, and work out that 3 miles distance between two islands is pretty close. So it's not that. We're not seeing Chinese and Russian ships, sailing around Greenland threatening it. If you go back 10 years or 15 years at the height of the Cold War, so maybe a bit longer than that, America had loads of bases on Greenland, and over years have cut costs and reduced them. They have all the permissions necessary to go back there if they wish. And had they started a gentlemanly conversation, they could have been back there in a heartbeat. Denmark have made that crystal clear. I think he said the other day, just because someone landed a ship there 500 years ago, well, he might want to mention the Mayflower while he's at it, because that's how America was formed. But, the fact that he's talking about the potential to use military force to make this happen, is that just a scare tactic? I mean, I think it is, personally, at least I hope it is. But what a ridiculous thing to do to a NATO nation. If he's genuinely concerned about the Arctic and the northern approaches and the Greenland, Iceland, UK gap. If only we had an alliance that was responsible for that part of the world called the North Atlantic Alliance or something like that. I mean, bloody hell. Why would you kill the very thing? And it probably does need a bit of waking up. We all know that the high north is an area that maybe we've taken her off the ball, or that maybe Russia and China are looking to exploit. Yeah, we all get that. So let's have a grown-up conversation about how NATO steps up into that function, not who nicks what. Because, of course, we all believe and we think it's the case. Like in Venezuela, it was oil, and in Greenland, it's minerals.
Yeah, that's interesting doing, as you say, looking at Greenland more objectively and going, it's lovely you use that Mercator. The fact is that if the world was a perfect sphere, then missiles launched from Russia, ballistic missiles, wouldn't go over Greenland. But because it isn't, was it an oblate spheroid? In other words, a slightly crushed. So that's why airlines go a sort of northern route across to America, and that's why ballistic missiles go across Greenland. And therefore, having detection systems there makes a lot of sense. As you say, the shipping routes now, I think it's the Northern Sea route that is opening up because of global warming. Why does that make a difference? Well, apparently it takes a shipping route from Europe to the Far East would drop from 13,000 miles to 6,000 miles. So it's a huge advantage. And all the polar orbits for military satellites need a tracking station. So there's all sorts of reasons why, and of course the minerals, quite a lot of oil, a lot of rare earth metals, stuff like that. But I did a bit of research into it, and there's a litany of companies that have gone bankrupt trying to get this stuff out because it's ferociously difficult to get out. Yeah, so the question then becomes, okay, so why? Why is it that and it is nothing new. I mean, for literally well over 100 years, America's been trying to secure Greenland. Back in 1940s, it offered $100 million, and Greenland effectively said it's not for sale. As you say, negotiation, Denmark's always said feel free, but the military choice is it will be easy for America to seize it militarily,
Yeah.
and probably they don't trust that Denmark has the robustness. I was looking back again that America last invaded Greenland during the World War II because Denmark was occupied, so America occupied Greenland. When it ended the war, they didn't really want to leave, and it
Yeah,
ended up with a
I don't think they invaded. There's a few governors in the states
yeah,
saying
yeah, but
yeah.
it was
While Denmark was occupied by the Germans, America acted as caretaker and then very gently
yeah,
gave it back. I mean, someone tweeted the other day a picture of the Risk board, that classic military strategy game, and they say we know exactly what Trump's up to, and when he starts to take Kamchatka, we'll know exactly what he's up to. Because if you look, if you were trying to secure the West or your bit of the Western Hemisphere, Canada, Greenland, Mexico, Venezuela, it all makes complete sense. If your idea of security is just to own all the countries around you, i.e., the risk strategy, as opposed to wrecking the alliances that have held us in good stead for so long along the journey of collecting territory, which is what a real estate guy would do, isn't it?
yeah. But in a way, I think we're starting to get, for me, to the nub of the problem because in their most recent, the America's National Security Strategy, they published about this, was it the Monroe Doctrine? And I looked into that. 1823,
Yeah.
President James Monroe, and it was a time when the British and the Europeans had their empires growing around the world, and America went butt out, not only in our country but our region. Western Hemisphere is ours. And it feels like that's exactly what America's doing again. It's going, we don't want our neighbors like Cuba Missile Crisis. We don't want Venezuela mucking us around. We don't want anybody threatening Greenland. And that's, whether, I mean, it tramples all over the rules, international law, and 195 nations, or whether big or small, we respect sovereignty. But fundamentally, where the hell does that leave NATO?
Well, I mean that is the question. I mean, the problem is, unfortunately, to many Americans who've never left the country, who probably would struggle to even find Greenland on the map. This all makes complete sense. And if Venezuela is no longer a threat, if Trump does secure all this oil, if Cuba now struggles, because what's been fascinating for me in this, of course, is the NATO element. But just before we go there, is where do they sit with Russia? Because 2-3 weeks ago, we thought Trump was cozying up to America left, right, and center. Now he's capturing Shadow Fleet tankers. The Russian Shadow Fleet is now like cockroaches. I mean, they're scattering across the world trying to run away. That leaves countries like Cuba horribly exposed because Venezuela might have expected Russia to have stood by them, but they all scarpered. So Russia is looking very, very weak here. And I wonder just how the phone calls, if there are still phone calls between Trump and Putin, are going. Because Putin might be looking at Trump saying, hang on a minute, I thought we were buddies. You're now starting to, push me out of your hemisphere. But that, of course, might be the deal. Trump might be saying, you get out of my hemisphere and I'll get out of yours. Now, that would make sense, which comes back to this NATO question, because, we all know that he's told Europe to step up. That's kind of a given now. We need to get on with that. But to destroy NATO by creating a military operation in Greenland, for which NATO, in theory, would be beholden to respond. So I've got a picture of Saka and Disaka, who's Disaka currently a Brit, standing there saying, well, we've got to respond. Well, you can't respond. It's me. Well, stop it. I mean, and the current, Secretary General of NATO has been invisible.
In a way, trying to make sense out of all of this, when Trump first came into office, he was pretty dismissive of NATO. He saw an alliance that only a third of the countries were paying their way. America was spending more money individually than the rest of NATO put together. And they came back into power for his second term and nothing really had changed. And then all of a sudden, Russia invades Ukraine. America turns around and said, hang on, this is on your European mainland. You've not been spending on defense and you expect me to come across here. And although NATO has been a bedrock, I mean, let's face it, it's NATO first is our defense strategy at the moment. But it's an 80-year-old. If we were inventing a defense organization today, would it look like NATO? The United Nations, because all these things were built up at the end of the Second World War, weren't they? Two devastating world wars. Got to stop that happening again. Let's create organizations that allow countries to talk, and let's respect all these individual nations. And at the time, there seemed an appetite for that. 80 years on, Russia's part of the UN Security Council, invades another country, walks all over the principles of the United Nations, makes it look a complete waste of time. International Criminal Court, International Court of Justice only works if everybody subscribes. America doesn't. Now, NATO seems to be creaking at the seams. And you've got some people still going, no, it's the bedrock, we've got to stick with it. And it feels increasingly the evidence on the ground, if the big dog isn't going to be part of it, then actually, if we were to be imaginative, what do we need today? America's looking at the Western Hemisphere, China, Eastern Hemisphere. We're in a fight for survival in Middle Earth with Russia. Individually, we're screwed. Collectively, get rid of Spain, Italy, those that don't want to pay, get rid of Hungary, those nations that actually are much stronger together. What does that look like?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things to think through here. I mean, we've got alternatives like the Jeff, which is growing like Topsy, and actually is interestingly is very much northern Middle Earth focused. And I think that's why NATO are trying to think their way through this logically. And it may be that logic's not going to work because they're trying to resolve the wrong problem. If Greenland is genuinely about security and America's security and the North Atlantic, then put more NATO presence in Greenland and Iceland and the Greenland-Iceland gap, and ensure, therefore, that Russian submarine and ships aren't able to just wander around willy-nilly, which is why you're seeing this discussion about NATO, European NATO, putting a greater presence in Greenland. I think that's been interpreted by some as an attempt to preempt an American invasion, but I think it's an attempt to take away the security argument by Europe stepping up to the plate. But if it isn't really about that, then that's not going to appease Trump. And that, I think, is the concern here, is that Europe and NATO are still trying to apply logic to a problem that may defy logic because it's for completely different reasons, both presentationally and really. I like to think that NATO will survive this. I think calm heads should prevail in America, that yes, get Europe to pay their way, and yes, still have a hand on the tiller, which America still clearly does, more so, but back away from the demand signal so that Europe's doing more of the heavy lifting. And I think that's a place that America could probably tolerate. Because if you're that concerned about Russia and China, why wouldn't you want a strong NATO buttressing up against Russia to at least eliminate that particular threat? And that's where the rhetoric doesn't work. Because one minute Trump's saying, Russia's not really the problem. I'll trade that. I'll make buddies with them so I can take on China. Well, if that's the case, why are you talking about the Russian threat to Greenland? So, yeah, there's a lot of things here that don't make sense. And I think a lot of old school diplomats are struggling with the narrative here because it doesn't compute.
No, except that where it does compute, and I'm always struggling. I've had a couple of conversations with people in the last week who've sort of said, "Oh well, Trump is obviously mad," and you go, "Okay, we people use that logic about Putin." You go, I'm not sure that's fair. Let's look at it more objectively. If America first is not about isolationism, if it's about regional dominance, then it makes complete sense. And it would explain why Trump is less worried about Russia and Putin and just going, I'll help if I can. But frankly, you Europeans have got to work out who's the big dog there. It's not for
Yep.
me to decide.
Yep.
And if China is less about fighting China and more about freedom of access to the seas and stuff like that, knowing that China is, if not going to, dominate the Far East, then, and it leaves questions about what happens when, not if, China goes into Taiwan.
Yeah.
We've always said there's probably nothing's going to happen, but Trump seems to, by going into another sovereign nation, has opened the door for China to do that.
Well, and
Um,
and he may even accept that as a consequence because he'll let them, as you say, have the East and he'll keep the West. And I think we've all seen the war games between America and China. They're not pretty from either side. So there's not much logic in going in. And Trump, says he's a peacemaker. So declaring war on China ain't the way to go. But maybe he thinks he can secure just about everything else, and that Russia is just a pawn to be kept at bay. I think you're right. I think the game that he's up to is as plain as the nose on his face. The problem we're all having with it is there are no rules that we recognise, and we either need to start recognising that that's the game he's playing and just live with it, or continue to fight it or rewrite it so it goes back into the rules box. Well, that ain't going to work anymore, I don't think.
if you were Trump, so let's continue this. If you were Trump looking across at Europe, you'd look at the UK and go, okay, you've made some promises in 10 years' time to triple the defence budget. But what are you doing today? There's a threat today. And we're increasingly seeing stories and news backed up by personal anecdotes that some of our military chiefs are getting angry at the moment because not very much happening. The Defence Investment Plan, which was meant to come out at the end of, I think it was the end of autumn, is still not out. And you see increasingly, an island nation that was once the centre of one of the biggest empires in the world is now outside the European Union, alone, looking increasingly fragile and vulnerable. What do you do?
Yeah. There was a couple of really good pieces put out recently. One was from the Council on Geostrategy, which is basically a Royal Navy think tank, thinly disguised, that came out with actually some really good stuff. There's like 12 maps that demonstrate the economy of the world, the way that UK fits within it. Unfortunately, it then leaps to a conclusion at the end that says, therefore, we should only have a navy and everything else can go fish. Because it was talking about an empire UK, one that could have influence worldwide. And you think, that's ridiculous. So there's still some people living in cloud cuckoo lands. I think quite a lot of people have got excited about the dip and the money that is allegedly on its way. And of course, now what we're seeing in the papers is there's a hole. I don't think that's a surprise to many of us. Now, £28 billion sounds like a lot of money, but over 10 years actually could be quite small beer, and actually is about when the 2.7 and the 3% kick in. So this is about problems downstream. But I think we all know that with money being put into housing, pay, stockpiles, Ukraine, etc., we're going to be short of cash for a few years because it's not going to be enough to back that up as well as fix all the past problems. There's a really good piece by Ed Stringer, who you and I know extremely well, for Policy Exchange, that said that for the MOD, the tide is now out, and it turns out they've got no trunks on. That was not the title, but it was his headline. Talking about how have we got to this stage? How have we written an STR that really identified, for the first time in a long time, the challenge and the honesty about where the gaps were, a government that for the first time was putting money into defence in a meaningful way. And I think it is quite unfair to be picking on Labour and Keir Starmer about, oh, they've bankrupt defence. I mean, I think the bankruptcy took place a few years ago. This is about how fast we should or shouldn't be filling back up the black hole. And we know the government's not got a lot of money to do that with. And I know there are choices you could make, but there we are. But Ed's piece really talks about how reform has not happened at the pace it needs to happen for these changes to genuinely take effect. And I think it's well worth a read. He actually talks in the end about doing an audit against fighting tonight. That's what they're doing in Finland and Denmark and Sweden. And you wouldn't you, when you're that close to Russia, as are Germany, as are Poland and the like. Where's the UK's plan for tomorrow morning or tonight? Now, I know we all think that's a distant likelihood, but having a 10-year plan is not an answer to that problem. Let's do that audit. Let's be absolutely brutally honest with what the problem set is, and then let's fund those gaps. And I'm afraid all this fanciful talk of 3% and 10-year plans, yes, we still need to think about that, but we need to solve today's challenge. And I think the lack of activity and the lack of money going into investing in defence industry is what's frustrating people now. Is the gap between Ed actually called it the say-do gap, and the gap between the rhetoric of we're at war, we need to be ready, to, well, hang on a minute, we haven't got a plan yet. Those two things don't jive.
No, it feels like in You're on My Time, but it's the difference between evolution and revolution, isn't it? It feels like the MOD has been used to doing things a certain way for so long, play it long, 10-year plans or whatever. And if you turn around and go, okay, not only has the world has changed, we're no longer expeditionary warfare, it's wars of national survival. And if NATO might be less reliable after Trump's amazing, I mean, I was just sat listening to his speech about NATO, where he turned around and, we'll help NATO, but they won't help us. He was almost writing the epitaph for NATO. And if you look at his actions and look at his words, that you can't gamble with the security of our nation. And therefore, but what I loved about Ed's philosophy there is, yeah, it's all very well saying we've got cupboards full of stuff, but what are we going to do? And I think it would be quite scary. I genuinely feel it would be scary. And I think for me, I mean, that's philosophical, but we cannot afford to replicate America. We just don't have the budgets. We don't have, so how do we form an alliance of the willing? I
Yeah.
don't take that literally, but what does, not NATO, but the new, whether it's a Jeff or whatever it is, who's a member? Do we all agree to play musical instruments in that orchestra so that together it sounds fantastic, but individually we are vulnerable? And where's that balance struck?
I think that's the beauty of Ed's argument, and I repeated it in my own words in a tweet the other day as well, is that by applying this to a real problem, a real and present problem, and we make the assumption that America invades tomorrow. Now, we all think that is a very small percentage chance, but let's use that as the template, because most military planning over the last 2-3 decades has been against fantasy scenarios. And when you're against fantasy scenarios, it's just a bit of what ifing. It's a bit of thinking. It's a bit of contingency thinking. You don't actually match up the requirement to the fundamental desire or demand. And if we were to do that, we'd spot the gaps pretty quickly. We'd realize what C2 structures wouldn't actually work, because America would say, we're not doing that. You can't have that asset, or you can't have this, you can't have that. That would make it starkly obvious of what the gaps are. And we would then have to step up to fix them, and not with a 5 or 10-year plan, with a fix it now. Hey, you SME, come here. I've got a problem, fix it, which is what Ukraine's doing in contact. And it almost would force us to do in contact thinking and planning. Now, that means you wouldn't have perfect solutions. You'd have very imperfect solutions, but they'd be solutions and they'd be on the shelf. But at the moment, all we've got is concepts and promises of capabilities downstream. Russia's not going to respect any of that. In fact, if he thinks we've got a 10-year plan, he thinks he can crumble NATO in 5. So
But
yeah,
where does that leave net Ukraine then? I mean, all of that, given that we've had the Coalition of the Willing meeting, my take on that was that it felt much more the narrative about trying to keep Trump involved, um, because frankly, they were citing some fantastic agreements about military forces going in, Brits committing forces or whatever. All of that was in the post-war era,
Yeah,
so it doesn't bring the war to an end.
yeah,
Secondly, you know, it, Putin's made very clear that he wouldn't countenance anything like that at all. So it felt like tinkering at the edges of something. And if we genuinely if Trump is tiring of NATO, wearying of getting involved in a European conflict, at what point do we have to wake up and go, right, if Ukraine is really a Western problem, is the future of our security inexorably linked to the survival of Ukraine? And if that was the case, we've got to massively rethink how we support Ukraine.
yeah. I mean, my feeling is it is, and largely because of the Russia factor here. Whether we like it or not, would we rather be facing Russia with Ukraine on our side, or with Ukraine subjugated under Russia? I think that the answer to that's pretty obvious. Um, and if we all believe that, and you would believe that from the rhetoric we hear from European capitals, then let's not just talk about it. We need to do something about it. Now, if that's more money, more weapons, more assistance, and we are doing a bit more, but how much more can we do? And I don't think we should stop talking about peacekeeping forces. I think we should be crystal clear. And who gave Russia a vote on what peacekeeping forces sit on Ukraine's sovereign territory? They don't get a vote. Now, they might not stop the war, but then we probably don't believe they're going to stop it anyway. So I think we should look to the future, which could well be our forces on the ground in Ukraine, because if not there, we'll be defending Europe somewhere else. And we need to stop. A number of soldiers I've heard come out saying, "Oh, we can't possibly do it. 15,000 troops, impossible." We've got a £60 billion annual defence budget. If we can't put 15,000 troops on the ground in a peacekeeping capacity as a tripwire response, not a war fighting organisation, but as a tripwire response, then we all need shooting, quite honestly. And I think that's a thinly veiled attempt, of course, to get more money for the army. But we also got to be realistic. We shouldn't make promises we can't keep. But I think we are still intrinsically linked to the Ukraine question. America isn't. That's clear. But actually, if it was an imperfect peace and Ukraine accepted it, in many ways, doing that and putting boots on the ground now, whether they be Brit, French, or other coalition, I think would be a positive step, because I think it would put a marker down against Russia and would create a strategic dilemma for Russia, because Ukraine would be on our side. And I think Putin knows this. I think that's the reason Putin doesn't want to have boots on the ground.
Wouldn't it look a lot like the Cold War, though? I mean, you and I, we spent our formative years based in Germany, didn't we? And
Well,
that was military bases,
yeah,
boots on the ground, air power, and the buffer zone, and
yeah.
monkey, brass monkey. This is all feels
I,
like the pendulum
I
swung again.
I agree. Too many old soldiers have equated this to a Bosnia scenario where we cycle troops in and out for 6 months tours of duty. I don't think we're talking about that at all. I think we're genuinely talking about rebuilding garrisons with families in Ukraine, maybe in the west of Ukraine, doesn't matter where. But yeah, that's how you solve the problem of recycling people through. It becomes a permanent garrison, and it might not be in NATO, but for all intents and purposes, it'll damn well look like it. And we will use that time to build Ukraine's capability, to train with them and get them up to speed, learn a lot of lessons off them at the same time, of course, and make Ukraine a really, really strong thorn in Putin's belly, so that the rest of NATO can also breathe a bit of sigh of relief. Because when you look at the graph that joins Ukrainian forces with European NATO forces, it dwarfs them. It's almost equal to European NATO. So yeah, I think Ukraine is absolutely a part of this solution, particularly with a more distant US.
Just feels there's a different conversation, though, isn't there, that has to happen with that. First of all, it's the urgency of what do we do now. Appreciate the country hasn't got spare money, but actually, if defence is the number one priority, let's at least wake up, smell the coffee, look and see that Trump's actions and his rhetoric are clearly pointing one way. And in my humble opinion, that's why the DIP has been delayed. I think there is a growing realization that this is monumental, that doing what we always did gets us what we always got, that the MOD largely is structured around a Cold War, post-Cold War environment, and it doesn't really work for the today's threat. I think that's something that it's going to have a profound implication for 2026. We started talking about it's been an interesting start to the year. I think this could be the chapter at the start of a brand new chapter in global defense.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, in many ways, if we were to do this exercise of fighting tonight, I think what would come out of that is how important Ukraine is to that equation, and to just let Ukraine suffer whatever it suffers, and then imagine that everything's going to be fine again, and we can all go back to a peaceful, world with Russia in some distant space. It just isn't going to be the case. It will not solve the problem. If anything, it will make it worse for NATO. So yeah, I think time for some honesty. No more fantasy, contingency planning or long-term planning. You obviously still need to do long-term planning. That's a given, but not in isolation and not at the expense of capability now. And we should prioritize the things that we can step up with now. You and I talked about this last time, and we believe this, don't we? That air power is one of those tools that is already in the box, that with a little bit of tweaking and a little bit of investment gives you a lot of clout for not a lot of outlay. Maritime may be similar, but we're in a dire position at the moment. So it does look like there needs to be quite a lot of investment there to turn that round. And it will take a while. And in the land sphere, I think we're miles off. And a little bit of cash here and there ain't going to fix that overnight. The good news is that Poland and Germany are building up rapidly and are between us and Russia. But that, for Brits now to be seriously considering taking a back seat in certain domains is a strange place for Brits to be, but time to wake up. The say-do gap, if you can't step up with the money, then stop making promises you can't keep as well.
Well, it might be that defence in Europe looks very, very different in the coming years, that the Brits being at the forefront because we were the bridge to America, suddenly we might be the outsiders. We're not in the European Union. We're a little island. We're not that influential anymore, and we're a long way away from the front line. Be really interesting in that dynamic.
Yeah, which is weird, isn't it? For a country that still spends an awful lot of money on defence compared to others, why are we talking about being a small bit player? We shouldn't. That should not be our ambition, I don't think. But it was interesting. I read this the other day that the JEF, the Joint Expeditionary Force, I remember being around when we stood it up in Strategic Command. And we were the leaders, and the Scandinavian and Northern European countries looked to the Brits to say, come on, Brits, you're the experts. How do we get out of this? How do we create something meaningful? How do we put in C2 structures, ISTAR, blah, 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 blah. We were very good at that, and we did it. They're now looking at us going, you're too slow. We'll just get on with this. So you've now got the Scandinavian countries, who are now, of course, all in NATO, combining their air forces to be one almost homogenous capability, because they've just said, right, we're not waiting for anybody else. We're just going to do this ourselves. So yeah, we are now lagging, and quite frankly, I forgot what the polite word is. Either get on the bus or get off, because at the moment we're sort of talking a good game, but we're not taking the lead role that perhaps we could or should.
It'll be a fascinating rest of the year.